Good morning from the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution and from Brookings Foreign Policy to all those who are joining us in the United States. Good evening to those joining us from Afghanistan and the region. Good afternoon to those in between. Today, I am delighted to have convened this excellent panel to talk about Afghanistan's twin human rights and humanitarian crises. The fundamental dilemma facing the international community when it comes to Afghanistan. Today's discussion will go beyond the usual discussions on Afghanistan, the withdrawal, and the condemnations of the Taliban to really discuss the lives of the 40 million people still living there and what the policy options are in front of the West, the US, the international community. I could not have thought of a better panel to discuss these issues. I'll introduce each of our four panelists in turn. We have with us Nahid Sarabi, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in our Brookings Global Division. Nahid was, before joining Brookings, the Assistant Resident Representative of the UNDP in Afghanistan, and before that, the Deputy Minister for Policy in the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan from 2017 to 2020. Kate Clark is the co-director of the Afghan Analysts Network, long experience in Afghanistan. Harun Rahimi is an associate professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. And last but not least, Bill Berg is a senior expert on Afghanistan at the US Institute of Peace with a long career at the World Bank. And again, a longtime expert on Afghanistan. So just, in a couple of minutes, I'd like to set us up for today's discussion, and then we'll delve right in. Since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, Afghans have been dealing with both a repressive regime and unprecedented economic hardship. They face two current crises and concurrent crises. One is a human rights crisis, and that mainly is a result of the Taliban's restrictions on women's ability to work and its ban on girls' education beyond elementary school. And that restriction on women's ability to work, as we'll see, has a direct effect on the delivery of humanitarian assistance, given the Taliban's recent decisions to impose restrictions on women working for NGOs and most recently for the UN. There is a dire humanitarian crisis that Afghans face, which has left 2/3 of the country, that's 28 million people, in need of humanitarian assistance, and an estimated 6 million people, in quotes, knocking on famine's door. And that's, directly according to the UN's top 8 official, Martin Griffiths. For the first year and a half of Taliban rule, donor assistance and the work of international and local aid organizations staved off the worst fears of a humanitarian catastrophe after August 2021. Bill has written that the UN has brought in about $3 billion a year. The UN, last year, the UN aid appeal for 2022 was $4.4 billion. The UN aid appeal for this year for Afghanistan is $4.6 billion. As of now, it remains mostly unfunded, and there are fears that it will remain underfunded. The sustainability of humanitarian assistance and the delivery of that assistance, as I mentioned, is under threat. Part of that is due to donor fatigue, and part of that is due to the fact that the Taliban in December last year, in December 2022, imposed a ban on women working for NGOs, Afghan women working for NGOs, non-government organizations, and in April, just this month, imposed a ban on Afghan women working for the UN. And that is a direct blow, of course, to women's rights and to humanitarian assistance. And it's really left humanitarian organizations, NGOs, and the UN in a bind as to how to proceed with aid delivery. There have been some exceptions granted on on the ground. Both NGOs and the UN are in communication with the Taliban, but it's unclear how things are really going to proceed. So we really get into all of that this morning. The West's fundamental dilemma here is how to deal with a regime intent on curtailing women's and human rights while still engaging in principled assistance, principled delivery of humanitarian assistance. But it has also, the Taliban's actions have also really seriously tested the resolve of donors to contribute to the country. So again, as I said, we'll start off discussing the humanitarian human rights situation and then get into the options that the international community has. You all in the audience can submit questions throughout the discussion by emailing events@brookings.edu or by joining the conversation on Twitter with hashtag Afghan crises, and that's crises with an ES at the end, given the dual crises that we're discussing today. So I'll start off by getting views on the assessment of the current situation from each of our panelists. Haroon, if it's all right, I'd like to start with you. You recently wrote a piece for Al Jazeera on Afghanistan's grim new reality. If you could briefly just lay out what you see as that grim new reality, the current situation, especially the economic situation, and what you would like the audience to know. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. For a bit of context, Afghanistan has been dealing with poverty for a very long time. Even before Taliban took over, most of the population was living below poverty line, and based on the best data we have, which is data is very complicated to get in Afghanistan. The structure of the economy before Taliban took over was that basically half of the economy in terms of contribution to GDP was service industry, construction, logistics, urban economy, what you may call urban economy, banking, the financial system, the hospitality industry, telecommunication and such. And the other half was half of that would be agriculture, and the other half would be the manufacturer, the manufacturing base, the small manufacturing base that existed in the country. When Taliban took over, and the entire system was very much dependent on the money that was being physically sent into Afghanistan to mostly pay for the war campaign, but also buttress the civil governance that was in place. When Taliban took over without any transition plan in place, because as you know, there was a negotiation process, there was hope that the transition would happen in a much more managed way. But it happened all of a sudden in an unplanned way. The whole economy, the whole structure of the economy came under a serious threat. Because there was a serious doubt that the foreign assistance to the country would continue, and as a result, the economy would collapse because the economy was so dependent on foreign assistance. What came to happen was kind of something in between, right? The worst case scenario did not happen, as you pointed out. The famine was averted, which was an achievement, but it came at a cost of injecting billions of dollars into the economy in the form of humanitarian assistance. But there was also a big chunk of the economy that was lost. The World Bank estimates that 25% of the GDP might have been contracted during that time. Mostly the service industry collapsed. The part of the economy that was very much directly linked to the foreign presence of foreign forces in the country. The urban economy was severely hit and constrained. The aggregate demand that was coming from people with some disposable income being able to spend money was gone. But the other sector of economy proved resilient. Agriculture proved resilient and might have actually shown some growth, partly because the major hostility ceased in parts of the country and people actually could grow more. There was some boost that came from the narco economy, because Taliban announced there would be a ban that caused prices to go up a little bit, and those farmers, at least that were sitting on some of opium, benefited from that. So there was some kind of improvement in that space, but overall the economy contracted, and the number of people living in poverty shot up. As you said, there was the prospect of universal poverty, and right now 2/3 of the population depend on foreign assistance just to get by, and that is continuous. As Bill, who's here, has said, these are due to kind of structural problems with the Afghan economy that the humanitarian aid cannot solve. And the international community has not been able to find an a kind of a modus operandi with the Taliban to come to an agreement that would allow for the economy to adjust structurally in a post-Taliban situation, because that would require commitment to infrastructure, energy, transportation. That would require easing of sanctions that would allow for foreign investment and some economic activities to resume. Those things have been curtailed by the Taliban's policy, as you pointed out, and also the international communities trying to figure out how to actually deal with the human rights situation in the country. As a result of this, we have this humanitarian crisis that doesn't seem to be going away, and no one seems to find a way out of it. With regard to how Taliban have done, like how they have reacted and managed all of this, I think many observers would say that they have done better than expected. They were actually good at taking over the Afghan government. The transition was relatively bloodless, and also their ability to actually take over the government institutions was reasonably, I think, well. The basic structure of government continued, and that is a positive thing. Some service deliveries continued. Taliban are still paying the public servants. Mostly the public servants are receiving their pays. They are able to do this because they're unburdened from other responsibilities of governance due to international assistance coming into the country. So that should be noted, that their ability to actually maintain even this reduced kind of low equilibrium of economic activity is dependent on continuation of major foreign assistance in the country, which is in serious jeopardy because of the restrictive edicts, and just the general fatigue that the international community is feeling with regard to how to deal with Afghanistan's fundamental problems that don't seem to be going away. I'll stop here, and if there are further questions, I can come back.
Excellent. Thanks so much for laying that out. I'll turn now to Kate. Kate, you have a recent report out with interviews on the humanitarian situation in the Taliban's first regime versus now. But I wonder if we could take a step back, and if you could sort of lay out what you see as the human rights situation now and previously in Afghanistan. Thanks. Kate, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Hello, everyone, with my voice. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, the best laying out of the human rights situation so far has been by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Richard Bennett, and it makes really grim reading. His second report was worse than his first. So, I mean, you look at, I would say the main problem is the fundamental freedoms that have been lost. And by fundamental freedoms, I mean the right to protest, the free press, a clear and transparent rule of law, having people in government who look like you. This is a much more narrow ruling government than we saw under the Republic, which for all its faults had a much more diverse group of people in power, both in terms of gender and ethnicity. We're now down to male, largely Pashtun clerics with a preponderance of Southerners, but doesn't reflect Afghanistan. And in a networked country like Afghanistan, where you need to find someone, to get your job, get your contract, sort out problems, it's really important that you have people in government and local government that you have a connection with. So those fundamental freedoms have been really watered down or lost. For women, of course, it's much more serious with the restrictions on movement, on dress, on work, on education. And then we see the sort of abuses of power in terms of revenge killings, the persecution of people that the Taliban believe are their enemies, whether they are associated with the old regime, the old military, or ISKP. And we've seen some very nasty violent attacks there, disappearances. We saw the disappearance of someone like Matiola Wisa, who's an education, advocate of education. So it's not just men who were previously associated with the armed forces that are being targeted. Women activists as well, who, of course, again, in a country like Afghanistan, in particular, where women's honor is held in such high regard, and women have always been somehow spared, largely, though not entirely, the worst excesses of the war. it's really nasty to detain women, and we don't know what happens to women in Taliban detention. What I would say, of course, is that the restrictions on women's rights, media freedoms, we have seen to a certain extent with regimes before, but the revenge killings are very, very familiar. And of course, after 2001, that includes the Republic after 2001, we saw US forces, the CIA, the military forces, engage in mass arbitrary detention, torture. There were people who died, Afghans who died under torture, use of dogs in homes, stripping men naked in public. We had men who were sold to the Americans by Afghan allies. We had Afghan allies turn in their enemies, tribal or factional enemies, claiming they were Taliban or Al-Qaeda. We saw the Pakistanis do that as well, Pakistan government. And in the north, we saw revenge attacks, murders, sexual violence, looting against Pashtun civilians by factions of the Northern Alliance. We also saw the international community, as they're called, backing men in power who could credibly have gone on trial for war crimes. So I think, one of the things to watch is not to assume that the Taliban are uniquely bad at this. This happens again and again. Every time there's a change of regime, there's a new cycle of violence. And one of the things that one hoped the Taliban would have learned is that treating your erstwhile enemies with dignity is really, really important for a stable regime. And I fear they are just storing up trouble for the future. Afghanistan needs a pluralist government to survive. And it really needs a government that respects all the citizens, not just those that it considers to be on its side. And I think that's the very, very serious lesson of history, not just from 2001, but going back to 78. Back to you, Madiha.
Thanks for laying that out, Kate. And thanks again for sort of placing this current moment in the context of history and Afghanistan's history. Naheed, if I could turn to you for your assessment of the current situation. Of course, you have experience, as I mentioned in your introduction, in both the finance ministry as well as in the UN. So you can sort of perhaps give us a perspective of your perspective of the current situation from kind of both those ends.
Thank you so much, Madiha, and a pleasure to be here, although it is not a really pleasurable topic to discuss. I think you have given, and also Mr. Rahimi and Kate have given enough of the background and data, and I would just allude to it, but I would remind all of us that the situation right now is underpinned by two factors of the faults in the development interventions of the past that we cannot ignore, but also the current humanitarian human rights crisis and atrocities that have been inflicted in form of the humanitarian crisis on the people of Afghanistan. So in the past, as you alluded, Madiha, the international community gave in form of development assistance, both off budget and on budget, around $3.5 billion per year to Afghanistan, which has all been replaced by humanitarian assistance right now. So imagine an economy that has been reversed in a way and replaced by only humanitarian assistance in a development perspective. Earlier, human rights appeals have been modest for Afghanistan, except the 2001 human rights appeal, which was over $1 billion. The amounts that have been appealed for Afghanistan have remained around 300 million above or below. So this current amount of 4.6 billion in the earlier years, the past 2 years, have been really an amount that equalizes the development budget that Afghanistan needed in the past during the Republic. And in that situation, if you put the whole economic activities into perspective, this cannot be sustainable in any way possible. For example, during the Republic, which, and if you want me to talk about some of the experiences, we had an overarching development program and a strategy that that the humanitarian board, but also development, catered to and tried to implement. You also had national programs that were uniformly implemented across Afghanistan that provided basic services and channeled humanitarian assistance to every corner of Afghanistan with the help of community development councils. Also, the structures under the Republic, one of them, which was the disaster management authority that helped and collaborated and coordinated humanitarian responses, is no more there to be responsible for the needs of the people. So there is a coupling of lack of coordination, lack of responsibility, but also lack of accountability around the humanitarian assistance coordination, but also development planning, which is part of this whole dilemma. So there are a few salient features of humanitarian assistance that, in terms of coordination, structures that were put in place during the Republic are not relevant right now, because in ideal situation, you would have a government that puts a plan that coordinates with its people, but also establishes a bond and a trust mechanism between the people in the government. And with the Taliban being in power right now, that kind of structure is not in place. So what happens is you're in a situation where the UN has taken the whole responsibility, but also the accountability part is a little bit missing. The reports that we hear on the ground is the lack of uniformity in terms of access of humanitarian assistance at in each corner of Afghanistan. The difficulty with women's mobility has impacted their access to aid. They have been barred and they have been hindered to access aid, distribution centers of aid, but also a major blow has been on the woman-headed households who do not have male companies to go to the distribution centers and access humanitarian aid. So such lack of accountability and lack of access has been major features of humanitarian assistance in the past. And with the lack of national programs and uniform access, the situation will be dire in the future, because if you do not have an economy that can counterbalance the impact of lack of access of humanitarian aid, it will have a heavier weight on the population in terms of poverty and resources. I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, we'll be happy to get back.
Thanks so much, Nahid, for laying out the sort of the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the coordination. That segues right into what I would like to ask Bill. Bill, you recently wrote an article in Lawfare where you discussed the sustainability of humanitarian assistance, and you argued that the amounts of humanitarian assistance are not going to be sustainable, and so you've argued for different mechanisms of humanitarian aid delivery, preparing for a gradual tapering down of humanitarian aid, and so on. So if you could tell us, sort of, if you'd like to comment on sort of your assessment of the current humanitarian aid situation and the prospects for continued humanitarian aid delivery for Afghanistan. Thanks.
Thank you, and very much appreciate the invitation to join this group. The other speakers have really covered almost all the ground. So what, with your permission, Medea, what I think I'm going to do is focus on some key points and recommendations rather than reviewing the humanitarian situation, which I think there's no disagreement about how bad it is, and similarly with the human rights situation. So my argument is that the international community needs to focus on its own behavior and performance, and in this case regarding humanitarian aid, and not just engage in short-term reactivity to whatever recent horror or whatever recent action the Taliban have done. There's been way too much reactivity, not enough forward thinking and forward planning. And what this means specifically for humanitarian aid, if it's in the range of $3 billion a year, that's probably roughly 20% of the current Afghan economy. And as Nahid rightly said, it's about not in the same ballpark as previous civilian assistance, total civilian assistance. And there's an urgent need to take a broader perspective on this aid. Need a macroeconomic perspective, need to take into account aid effectiveness and cost effectiveness issues, fiscal issues, fungibility. The recent UNICEF mistake, I would argue, in paying teacher salaries, which the Taliban in good budget practice offset right away, illustrates the problem. And also, of course, as you mentioned, Medea, the sustainability issues. Now, these approaches are actually foreign to humanitarian aid, and to some extent that's understandable, right? I mean, if you have a natural disaster, or you have a bad harvest or a flood or things like that, you want to bring in as much humanitarian aid as possible, as quickly as possible, and distribute it widely, basically to flood with aid to deal with a short-term crisis. That simply doesn't work when you have this kind of protracted economic downturn, which is, given Afghanistan's existing poverty, is a humanitarian crisis with risk of famine, as others have said. So that's why I'm making a plea for the humanitarian and international communities, and particularly the donors who actually fund this, to take a broader perspective and really look at how approaches can be improved, including through better coordination, which basically, I mean, weak and uncoordinated off-budget assistance in the previous government has been replaced by weak and poorly coordinated humanitarian assistance now. And so these things need to be addressed. I think there's one other point I think we need to be realistic about is when you provide $3 billion per year, including $2 billion per year in cash directly to the Afghan banking system, the idea that somehow you're not helping the Taliban at all is sort of ridiculous and should be thrown out. It should just be taken into account, and inevitably, if you're providing that level of assistance, the Taliban will indirectly or directly in various ways benefit, and how to manage and mitigate that rather than to try to keep blinders on and assume that everything goes through, let's say in food aid. That's fine, but not a penny for development. So I would argue that there's much that the international community can do if it reorients and retools this. I'm not that hopeful given all the bureaucratic inertia behind the humanitarian aid system as a whole, but I think it's really essential to try. And the reason is not that improving humanitarian aid will solve the underlying problems. We already know that. But in the future, given Taliban actions, I think we have to work on a reasonable assumption that there's not going to be much development aid and that humanitarian aid will decline. And so one of the imperatives is simply not to let this, to manage this decline in aid, improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the aid so that less aid will be able to deliver as much or close to as much as more aid did in the past, and try to avoid what people are already calling a fiscal cliff of a sharp drop in humanitarian aid. Let it be managed, gradual, maybe supplemented by other sources like the World Bank and et cetera, to try to manage the decline in aid so the Afghan economy can adjust. and try to avoid basically almost at all costs a repeat of what happened in August 2021. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you for sort of spelling that out for us. What I would like to do is have, Kate, you have a point. Why don't you jump in here?
I just had a question for Bill. Okay, given the constraints on aid and how it's spent, and the constraints on the economy brought about by sanctions, even though they've been watered down, there's still this problem with the corresponding bank and the lack of independence of the Afghan central bank. The frozen funds, I know the Taliban always raise that, and economists always say, well, that they're sort of all right where they are. They strengthen the Afghani. The government wouldn't be spending them anyway, but maybe they would. All these issues, and we've got the ban on narcotics now, which will hurt the economy. I mean, what would you suggest the sort of non-aid strategies that could help the Afghan economy without helping the Taliban, or with the side effect of helping the Taliban? Do you have ideas there?
Well, I think, and you alluded to it, the Taliban are shooting themselves in the foot in so many ways. And we've seen parts of this movie before, I would argue, in 1978 and also in 2001, overreach, revenge, et cetera, as you mentioned. So I don't know how you do, some of this is just actually what's in the best interest of the Taliban. I mean, right now we're in an almost unprecedented situation that there's no major armed opposition to the Taliban that would threaten its rule. I mean, ISIS-K is obviously engaging in terrorist attacks. They're not even trying to control or gain territory at the moment, unlike in 5 or 6 years ago in Nangarhar, et cetera. So it's unprecedented, almost unprecedented in the last 50 years in terms of not having any major armed opposition. And on the level of aid, it's also somewhat unprecedented that the level has really gone down already if you take out all the security assistance and all the contracting, et cetera, which was huge. The only slightly comparable situation I would argue might be, and there were very different dynamics at work, be the immediate post-2001 honeymoon period, when the Taliban were completely defeated. Nobody thought they would come back. Pakistan, yes, behind the scenes, beginning gingerly to support them, not right away. And the situation was so good that it took about 4 or 5 years before the Taliban came out back at all. So, and there, there can be some lessons from that. But I think one of the big lessons is, can the Taliban do things in their own best interest? And as a regime, as a brutal authoritarian regime, of which there are many around the world, right? And staying in power, they're doing things which are against their long-term interest. I would not argue that they're at any risk of near, any immediate collapse, whether they last 3 to 5 years or 30 to 50 years is anybody's guess. But it is kind of frustrating that they're doing, and the way they're probably overdoing it on revenue. They're now getting interference by the Emir in the budget expenditures. These were things that they were actually managing pretty well, as Arun suggested earlier. So I'm sorry, I'm just ranting a little bit on it, and I'm not sure I'm giving any good answers, but I do think that engagement and dialogue on some of these technical issues should be continued. I'm not arguing for the reserves to be released. The Taliban have already built up reserves. I suspect they must have tens, if not hundreds of millions of reserves from all these UN cash shipments, and they have done so. The Taliban need to manage the economic adjustment, and I think supporting that without non-financially would be helpful to Afghans in general, and certainly the opium ban makes no sense at all.
Thanks for that, Kate and Bill. You've already touched on some of the questions I wanted to ask. So I'm just going to lay out, sort of what I want the second half or a little bit less of the discussion to focus on. And we've touched upon some of these things. In the meantime, I will say again to our audience, You can submit questions to events@brookings.edu, or you can join the conversation on Twitter with #AfghanCrises. Send us any questions. Essentially, I'll turn to policy options for the UN, the US, the international community, right? This question of, do we have any leverage over the Taliban? And there are two aspects to that. Leverage over the Taliban in terms of their edicts, policies, behavior on rights issues. Leverage over the Taliban in terms of transitioning Afghanistan into an economy that functions beyond this low-level equilibrium that it's become, beyond where just there's an infusion of humanitarian assistance and the sort of the economic situation as it's laid out. What is the international community's ability to engage with the Taliban to affect their policies, their behavior in order to change outcomes for Afghans? And you touched upon this, the question of sanctions, the question of the Afghan fund. The Afghan fund currently, of course, has $3.5 billion from foreign reserves, given the verdict of the court, which has said that which has denied the families of 9/11 victims the rights to the other 3.5 billion. I assume the other 3.5 billion is going to go to the Afghan fund, but we haven't really heard much at all about where the Afghan fund is going. So what is the prospect of using the Afghan fund to improve outcomes? Of course, foreign reserves aren't meant for humanitarian assistance, so there's that. Are there any policy levers? And people have talked about, of course, again, the lever of recognition, but that's not something that seems to be on the table, and it's not clear whether that will make any difference. So what do you think are the policy options for the UN, the US, the international community? And where do you think, what is the least bad option? Because they're all in some ways bad options. I think Haroon had his hand up, so I'll go to you, Haroon, first. Then
I'll try to keep it very brief. I think not doing bad things is a good option too. There is a principle of no harm. I think there is this kind of sense that something has to be done immediately, and some people expect breakthroughs. The honest truth is there is not going to be any breakthrough. But if you create this expectation of a breakthrough, then it pushes actors to do something that could be very dangerous. For example, people flirting with the idea of recognition, the UN flirting on the idea of recognition as like basically going for the nuclear option or the last resort as a way to solve a problem that is not going to be solved, even if we kind of take steps towards that front. And instead, looking at some of the other issues that are much more difficult to do, they're not going to have immediate return, but could, over the long term, put the economy on a trajectory where it could actually sustain itself better than it does right now. For example, people talk about frozen assets. Taliban would love to talk about that. But that doesn't compare to the amount of money that's been injected into the economy. I mean, $3 billion is not going to solve Afghanistan economic problems. Last year, more than $3 billion was injected into the economy. I mean, if all of that foreign reserve were actually given to Afghanistan, it would not have made a major difference in the Afghan economy. The currency has remained stable because of that injection of the money. The UN stopped sending money into Afghanistan for the month or so, but the USD did not collapse as many had expected. It tells me that we don't have good kind of sight, transparency on what's going on in the Afghan economy. We may not appreciate how the economy is functioning. We may be looking at the levers we have and thinking about how we can influence things, but we may not have a full image of what's going on. There's a kind of a parable of someone looking for the keys under the lights, and someone asked them, "Did you lose the lights? Did you lose the keys here?" And they said, "No, but the lights is here." So this is what we are looking at. That's what I'm looking at. That's where I'm searching, because that's where the light is. Afghanistan Ministry of Commerce says that they've issued unprecedented numbers of business licenses over the past year. I mean, the economic activity is going on. And if you ask me what are the things that are stopping those economic activities to flourish, I would say you have to think about the issue of banking more seriously. But that does not involve unfreezing assets. I think unfreezing asset will not be the major factor. Finding a way for businesses to actually be able to operate would be a more important factor. in my experience in Afghanistan, manufacturing industry suffers from energy issues, access to electricity, finding ways to actually make sure people can actually, companies can actually get energy so you can actually do certain things in Afghanistan is very, very important. Sometimes we have models of some more advanced economies in mind, and we are saying things cannot get better in Afghanistan because of all those major issues. But we don't appreciate how low the level of current level is, and there's how much improvement can happen despite those constraints. And I think we're not to the point where the major constraints are the unsolvable kind of hard limits on the Afghan the structure of Afghan economy. So what Bill said, think about non-financial tools, how governance looks, how does economy function, what kind of set of institutions and infrastructure you need to actually make the economy work, and then offering what Taliban are willing to take on those fronts, because they are the ruler of the country at the moment. And if they're not willing to take it, I think maybe not doing anything would be better than just trying to appear like we are doing something for the purpose of domestic audience in some countries, and then creating even bad incentives for Taliban to behave. I think we sometimes, many of us pointed out to the negative trends we are looking at. And I would credit some of it to how the international community and the humanitarian assistance has been done in Afghanistan. I think it maybe thought that Taliban were much more physically conservative, I think, before. Now, I think they are just much more loose when they're in financial regulations, because they have, like the previous regime, benefited a lot from the money coming in. And I think the idea that they are responsible, have to keep things together, is eroding a little bit.
Thanks, Harun, and thanks for alluding to the important principle of do no harm. I think that should be the fundamental sort of starting point. I think, Bill, you wanted to come in next, then Kate, if I'm not mistaken, and then Naheed.
Yes, just quickly, I think we should start thinking about leverage as a dirty word. I think it goes back to my earlier comment that this is an unprecedented situation with no major armed opposition supported by a neighboring country. And aid, although it's very substantial, is certainly not as high as it's been sometimes. So if the international community is not going to arm an opposition and do, institute or try to undermine the regime in that way, and the aid is a limited instrument that you can't really use without further hurting the Afghan people. So we should get out of this leverage business and trying to influence the Taliban actions. I mean, maybe I wouldn't hold out that much hope. They're going to be an authoritarian regime. So I think people also confuse sometimes the political inclusiveness, which is a non-starter, with maybe more pragmatism on economic, business, private sector, and I would argue even women's issues that might be more possible as long as the Taliban don't see this as completely threatening their power, which I think they do see a lot of it that way. So my point just being, and I agree with what Harun was saying, do no harm, or maybe realistically try to minimize the harm rather than a knee-jerk reaction. For example, the UN pulling out, which oddly they didn't do with the education ban or the NGO ban, but they do it when it affects their own staff who are minimally involved in aid delivery. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? I mean, so I'm quite concerned there are going to be knee-jerk reactions. There's going to be a snowballing effect, and I think also the Taliban need to understand donors are simply just going to dry up their funding over time. And the real question is, how can that be managed in a way? Because I think the Afghan economy does have some positive features that could start adjusting if it's allowed to do so. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And leverage as a dirty word. That's a sort of a good way to put it, given the fact that leverage has not worked, and we are sort of the narrative on this from the international community still brings that word up, right? And I think I wrote a piece last month basically saying the U.S. has to sort of change its messaging when it comes to Afghanistan. Some of the things that the U.S. has done, including the Treasury Department granting workarounds to sanctions, has been very effective, although within limits. But the context and the discussion is so politicized here that everything is discussed in the context of, pressure on the Taliban, leverage on the Taliban, and so on, and really in terms of the figuring out how the Taliban can change behavior, and it hasn't worked. And I think it's time to accept that and work beyond that. We also have some questions come in, and some of Bill, you alluded to this, so I'm just going to bring this in, and I know Kate, you're next. The UN, what can the UN reasonably be expected to do in a situation where women workers, Afghan women, are banned? What do we expect the UN to do now? Is it just a knee-jerk reaction? Is it what should we expect over the next few months? But Kate, your response to that, if you would like, but obviously all of the other sort of discussion we've been having in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the conditionality. When have Afghan governments ever responded to conditionality? I mean, Hamid Karzai didn't, Ashraf Ghani didn't. The Taliban have been absolutely ungrateful to Islamabad for all the help that Pakistan gave during the insurgency. They turned to the TTP. I mean, it doesn't work. Afghanistan is not a country where conditionality has worked. And why would it work with the Taliban when, they've seen the foreigners back their enemies with military and with aid. Remember that the US Army explicitly talked about aid as a weapon. And even though humanitarians were bitterly condemning the use of aid by the US military and others, the PRTs, they still went ahead with it. And of course, the aid workers were tarnished. The big donors are all backers of the old republic. This is the Taliban don't trust foreigners. They don't trust foreign aid. And look at what they say. I mean, it does remind me from the 90s. You'd say, well, how do widows without men in their family, how do they earn a living? And the Taliban would say, well, God will provide. And it's the same now. The Mujahid, the spokesperson, when asked, there was a woman calling the BBC Pashto service. She said, "I've got 6 kids. I'm a widow. I work for an NGO. How does the Emirate expect me to feed my children?" And the response was, if you can't find a way to feed your children in a Sharia compliant manner, of course, Sharia, depending on the Taliban's interpretation of that, which is not a mainstream Muslim interpretation, you have to find one. You can't. In their eyes, they are protecting Afghan women from foreign decadence and influence. That's what they say, and there's no reason not to believe them, I don't think. So for them, it's an absolute red line that they think it's a domestic issue, it's an internal issue, that it's nothing to do with foreigners. And if the foreigners are interested, there must be a subtext. They must be trying to corrupt Afghan women. So, for all those reasons, and the Taliban in the 90s and now, they're very good at they know that about the humanitarian imperative, that's the, saving lives is the absolute requirement. And they'll say, well, are you going to let people starve? So the desire of aid agencies and the UN and the donors to carry on with the system, I would say, is stronger than the Taliban's concern about aid ending. That may or may not be realistic. They have a strong belief that God will provide, and better if they can do without Western agencies. So I think expecting that aid to be conditional is wrong anyway from the humanitarian perspective, but it's not a good policy. It won't work. So there has to be other ways around to have a conversation. Back to you.
Thanks, Kate. Nahid, over to you.
So let me go back to the question Kate asked a few minutes ago on how to help the economy. And I'm a believer that you cannot expect the economy to flourish without the existence of a strong state, without proper state institutions, without a state that would put reforms in place. So to expect that you help the economy without the regime being responsible for it, I think, is not really a valid idea, and there aren't so many nuances that we can think about, or innovative ideas that one can that one can think of. So here's the question: that do we want a strong Taliban, as many people have been posing this question, or not? So, are you going to support an economy that then would, in a way, support the Taliban authoritative regime? And back to the issue of conditionality, it also depends what type of conditionality the international community is putting there. And also from the experiences we had, Kate rightly mentioned it in the past, that these conditionalities never stop. So it adds as you go along, and there isn't an aim at the end of the day. But if the international community takes a value-based approach versus a practical one, there are two options, literally, is to continue with humanitarian aid with no conditionality, and then on the other side, you have the other option of the neighboring countries and the UN agencies to be uniform and to act uniformly. They have to decide whether the issues of female ban or female ban working in NGOs is an operation inconvenience, or it's a value-based approach. And I'm the one that believes in a more value-based approach, because then you put a precedent for the future act. So you have the humanitarian aid going on, which may not be the response versus the crisis that everyone is facing, but you can keep some of the basic services going on. But at the same time, you have the neighboring countries engaging in trade and project contracts with the Taliban that would bring benefits to the state, to the regime that has been restricting everyone of the basic services and basic human rights. So I think this is the dilemma that the international community and the donors have to choose, and I think they have to talk between these two options going forward.
If I can come in, I mean, I think you need to unpack this conditionality. I think what Ms. Sarabi said is very on point. I think built on what Kate said, that there are certain conditions that have to do with aid effectiveness. And those conditions, I think it's not a value issue. It's like, you're not going to give money if it's not going to actually help people. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And if you stop that money, you're not killing people. I think you're not really contributing to more harm, because if continuation of the money is not really helping the problem, solve the problem you intend to solve, I think the money should stop. So if there should be, and I think it requires frank conversations that cannot happen like with media spotlight and everything being charged, and Taliban seeing everything as an attack on their ideology, and the world bullying them, and the world see every action as a position to do kind of grandstanding on human rights. It cannot happen there. It has to be a technical level, saying, okay, this is what it takes to actually feed people, and these are the steps that need to be taken from your side. These are the steps that we're going to take from our side to actually make it happen. If it cannot happen, then people are not going to feed, and they're not going to get something to eat, and that is it. That is it. There is no reason to continue sending money if it's not going to help the stated goal. It cannot be an either or. I understand that there's a matter of risk. I mean, no government in Afghanistan has done a perfect job, and no UN patient in the world has done a perfect job. We're not expecting perfection, but you can have reasonable conditions there. But then you go one step further, and that's what Mr. Rabi is saying, is that, do you want to help Afghanistan economy get better? That is a genuine question. I think many are kind of going around and beating around the bush, but do you want it to get better? Because there are things that can be done with Taliban actions taken exogenous, like what are doing, like assume that Taliban are going to act as Taliban. And I think many people on this panel have pointed out in their writings that Taliban have acted as predicted. Like they did not do something that would make us question how we understand the Taliban. So knowing what Taliban are as an oppressive authoritarian regime that values ideology over well-being of people, That is the government you're dealing with. That is the people in charge. Knowing that, there are things that can be done that would allow the Afghan economy to adjust. It's not going to become a flourishing economy. I don't think Afghanistan will get to a flourishing economy unless it becomes a place where people want to live, people want to invest, people want to dedicate their lives to actually making better. I mean, countries in the world have struggled to get out of poverty with a lot better kind of alignments between people and population and the international community. But do you want to get the economy, let the economy to get better a little bit, to kind of get a little bit higher equilibrium, to lessen the humanitarian assistance, and hopefully maybe put on kind of the dominoes in effect that eventually would lead to people demanding for more? Because if a population that is in survival mode is not going to be care about political rights. And to be honest, I mean, how much the people in the Western capital take care about the political rights does not match how much people are struggling to care about political rights, right? So you can think about, okay, I'm going to let the economy get better so more people can actually be able to breathe and to maybe think about more things, and maybe some domestic kind of dynamic would lead to some opening, right? Or you think, no, Taliban are a cancer and we're just going to flood the whole system with some sort of chemical that would weaken the whole systems in the hope that the Taliban regime would collapse. And these are real choices, because many would argue that Afghanistan going to suffer longer under Taliban if Taliban stay in the power longer. And if you can do something to shorten the rule, even if it's going to be more painful, it may be better. I think those fundamental issues are not resolved. And now we talk about, I mean, when we talk about value-based approach, we haven't gotten kind of, I think, an answer on those fundamental issues. I think many in the different countries in the world have different views as what should be. And the current approach is like, let's not do much and let's just try to limp around along, which I think, as Bill said, it is going to come to an end. And maybe it's going to come to an end in a situation where it's going to be an actual cliff. The sooner we actually have those hard conversations, I think the better prepared we'll be to think about what are the steps that have to be taken to actually make Afghanistan economy maybe have a chance to recover. Because right now there are things that we do to make it so that Afghanistan can not actually get better. That is a fact, and I think many could agree with that.
Excellent. Well said, Harun. I think we are close to the hour mark, so I'm going to actually just say a word or two and then turn it over to Bill and Kate for any final thoughts, or if Harun and Nahid want to come in, just sort of a 30-second thoughts, and then we'll close. I would say that this has been an extremely rich and nuanced conversation, and it sort of I think the way ahead for the international community is sort of clear. The conversation needs to go beyond leverage, conditionality, and so on, to really talking about what we can do given the constraints we face, given, as Harun said, the Taliban's sort of exogenous behavior. This is behavior that is not being affected. What can we do, sort of the values driven approach versus kind of a more practical approach. What are we taking? What are the choices? Is the international community aligned on this? Are some countries not? The international community is aligned on the lack of recognition, lack of diplomatic recognition, but on the nuances, on the sort of the nuts and bolts, that there may not be as much alignment. So with that, Bill, Kate, any final words, and then I'll wrap up.
I'd like to reinforce what Harun was saying. There are a lot of things that can be done, and people are focused wrongly on things like the frozen reserves, or for that matter, the sanctions. The sanctions have been very much clarified. What is stopping the banking transactions is not the sanctions per se. It's the basically cautious and profit-oriented approach by international banks. Maybe there's some ways to deal with that. There are workarounds, there are swap arrangements, there are digital currency transfers. This is crying out for one or more of the big humanitarian donors to actually try to push things, because they're the only people who have leverage over. We're talking about leverage over the UN system and the humanitarian aid bureaucracy. Thanks, and thanks for a very enlightening talk.
I mean, I would say there are no good options, and that's one of the lessons of the current situation, is that everything is pretty grim. Whether you're an NGO trying to work on the ground, working out what to do with the ban on working women, what do you do? Or if you look at the whole situation, the current way of dealing with Afghanistan is horrible. The amount of money that actually is not helping Afghans is must be phenomenal, because you've got so many levels of money coming down. You've got big agencies, the UN, that pay a lot more, that have their headquarter costs. You know, it's a really inefficient way of doing things. And it could be that the foreigners get blamed because people hear about the amounts of money, as in the Republic, and think, what's happening with my life? Who's benefiting? It's also open to corruption. And, you know, the Taliban have boasted about not being corrupt, and certainly on the revenue phase, the collection, they've been pretty good, much better than the Republic. We don't know what they're spending their money on. So there's the problem with fungibility as well. And with, you know, in an economy that's so hard hit, if you're in power in a place that has been used, can I just say this very diplomatically, has been used to state actors benefiting from power to get contracts, to get procurement, to get mining concessions, to cream off money. I mean, I'm not saying that the Taliban are doing that. We don't know, because there's no information, but that has been the tradition. You would have to say that with aid being such a large part of the economy, you were 20%, Bill, you thought? You know, one would expect that to happen. So it's not a great system. It stopped people starving. The money has, you know, protected the Afghani, it's protected Afghans from price inflation. But really, is this the best that can be hoped for from Afghans by the international actors and by the Taliban? And, you know, I don't think it's fair to blame either side for this mess, because it's built on lots and lots of red lines as to what people will be willing to do and what they're not willing to do. And this is the situation that we've ended up with, that Afghans have ended up with. It's not pretty, and actually sort of working out a better way of doing things is really, really tough, and will also have hard choices and compromises, dilemmas and risks and you know, problems. So that I would say, you know, this is something that needs working on, but the way ahead is, I would say, it's far from clear.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. Thanks, Kate, Bill, Haroon, Naheed, for a very nuanced, sobering conversation, yet, you know, a very realistic conversation on where things stand in Afghanistan in terms of both the human rights and humanitarian situation, and, you know, an assessment of what the international community has done to date, where it has worked, where it has not worked, and the need to move beyond the current way of doing things, I think, is clear. What that path will be is not yet clear, but it's clear that we need to move beyond the current sort of paradigm that the international community is engaged in, and you know, the call for the U.S., the West, and the UN and others to have that discussion and to make have those hard conversations is there from our side. I hope we can convene this excellent panel again. All well-wishers of Afghanistan to have a conversation on the path forward at some point, and hope things will look less bleak, less grim at that point in time. But in the meantime, again, thank you so much for joining us. To our panelists, thank you to the audience for joining us, sending your very thoughtful questions in. And on behalf of the Center for Middle East Policy and the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, we hope you'll join us for future events on Afghanistan and other related topics. Thanks.